This is that 59 Fender Vibrolux. It's all restored, a few tweaks to offset some of the weirdness of the original circuit. Just take out some blocking distortion and artifacts in the tremolo while retaining the core sound that everyone wants from these things. I'm really happy with the way it came out. Let me show you everything that we did, and then we'll get a chance to really hear it. Let's go through everything in non-chronological order, that is, not in the sequence that I did things. First of all, I had a lot of excess on this secondary common wire, just lots of excess copper looping around, with a bad solder joint to the frame of the transformer. So I shortened that and neatened it up and got a good solder connection. This old copper wire, that's actually the wire inside the winding, and it's covered in a red enamel. And it's a pain in the butt to scrape off and tin, but I did it because it was worth it. And there was a lot of shellac on the frame of the output transformer, and that shellac was preventing these chassis mounting screws from actually getting this frame tied to chassis, which is ground, which meant that the secondary did not have a good connection to ground either. So I had to scrape off. It sounds crude to say scrape off, but shellac flakes off fairly easily if you're careful without damaging the metal underneath. And then I got good metal to metal contact on both sides of these tabs of the frame. So this is now neat, much shorter, good ground connection here, good ground connection to the chassis. It would be better not to rely on the transformer connection to the chassis for ground, but that's how they did it in these old girls. Second of all, the octal sockets were loose beyond repair. They just vibrated like crazy, and tubes wanted to fall out. So new Belton sockets with Belton bear trap retainers, and these tubes aren't going anywhere. This is a pair of RCA 6v6s. The owner provided two pairs, one of which was bad. These are good. It's got the old rectifier, possibly original to the amp. It's got these Philips mini watt ECC 83s, which are not original to the amp, but they're very good new old stock tubes. The owner provided four, three of which were good. These sockets were loose. I was able to tighten them a bit. They were very dirty. I cleaned them. And the rubber grommets had degraded and needed to be replaced. So I took them all apart and replaced those. And the output jack had been a little bit loose over the years. And because it was a little bit loose, contamination, just corrosion had built up between the mating surface for ground of the jack and the actual chassis. So that was taken apart and cleaned, and I had to recrimp the connections to the phenolic because the jack itself was a little bit loose over the years. So all that's tightened up, good metal to metal surface contact. Checked this one, it was fine, but I still cleaned the jack with some, we call it deoxit. As far as the tube sockets, everything's solid and clean, good jack connections, good ground, all the hardware is tight. Let's move to the inside. All right, so the power switch that came in it was a Carling, just like this one, only it was cutting out. It wouldn't always come on. So new Carling power switch. The power cable has been rewired so that the hot goes to the fuse, the inmost part of the fuse holder, then to the power switch. The neutral is just spliced to the other primary of the power transformer. But it's a good splice beneath the wire. It's mil spec and then heat shrink to keep it from touching anything else. A little excess length on the ground wire, so if this cable were to pull out, the ground would be the last thing to break, and that solder joint was redone, as was this chassis ground. I'll show you other stuff in this area that you can't see in this angle. We'll get back to the rectifier in a minute as well. Down at this end, all three input jacks were slightly loose with some corrosion on the chassis. So I removed them, cleaned everything, cranked them tight, reflowed the solder joints. And of the three 68K grid stoppers, one of them was failing, causing leaking DC on the input. So you'd have scratchy volume pots on your guitar. It was present if you're in here, not in this one. So I'm pretty sure it was not this one, but one of these two, because the way this is wired, I don't have time to get into it, but one of the three was faulty. So I went ahead and changed all three. So, half watt carbon comps, just like the originals. though the originals would have had the silver tolerance band rather than the gold tolerance band. Let's move on down the line. All right, in the tone stack, the original Domino was still good. This Astron was one of the only three that were still good in the amp. Original pots here. Had to replace the intensity pot. Now, the original intensity pot in this amp was bad, and that's a critical part of the circuit because here is the bias supply, here is the wiper which goes to the output tubes, here's the signal from the tremolo circuit that makes it tremolo on the output. And if the connection to bias goes away, the output tubes will not be happy. You can lose tubes, you can damage transformers, you can burn things. So I added this additional resistor from wiper to bias, so should this pot ever fail open, it will still have a bias connection. It will be really cold and the amp won't sound very good, but nothing will be damaged. This resistor takes the thud and the glitch sound out of the tremolo, which is more apparent at higher gains as far as the glitch goes, but that thud was always there. And I had some shrink wrap on here, but it looked ugly and really didn't do anything of use. It looks like it's perilously close. It's not going to move. I mean, if you go in there and force it to be over there, it will be, but it's not going to go anywhere. This kind of construction was used on a lot of JMI AC30s, and it's just fine. While I'm in this area, these 100 ohm resistors are the heater balance resistors, which were added because I gave the amp a real heater supply. Rather than having half the heater supply just at chassis, as in stock form, it now has a balanced heater supply. And that greatly reduces noise. It's something that Fender did on a lot of their, quote, budget or student model amps. And on the big boys, the Twins and the Basemans, they did a real heater supply. So this is just emulating that. You can see I've added screen grid protection. I slightly increased the grid stoppers because this cathodiene output phase inverter is prone to noise. Redid chassis grounds here on pin 8 of each tube to a new chassis connection because the old one had the heater going from here to here to here, and we needed this to mount the screen grids. So we no longer had the heater at ground here, so I had to redo grounds here. Nice shiny new chassis connections all cleaned up. You can see that the new octal sockets are mounted with nylock locking nuts, which is nice. You can see the preamp wiring remains pretty much stock, though I neatened it up a bit, though I had to go over the new heater wire here. I wish I'd had cloth covered 20 gauge for this. This is cloth covered 18 gauge. It's a bit large, but it works just fine. It's harder and harder to find vintage correct wires in all the various diameters we might wish. So this cathode now goes over. No big deal. It doesn't change anything. And this grid now has an additional large value grid stopper, which helps prevent grid blocking, grid clamping and blocking distortion in the phase inverter. Let's talk about the stuff on the board next. The owner provided Jupiter caps, and he had installed Jupiter caps in here and the same values that were in the original. And he wasn't happy with the sound. And he provided some spare Jupiter caps. And I've gone through here and reduced the value of this cap, and these caps to raise the high frequency pass point from about 7 hertz to about 36 hertz. So it's still passing everything an octave below the lowest signal frequency you're going to have on your guitar, but it's not trying to amplify all the 7 hertz stuff, which the tubes dutifully try to recreate. It robs the amp of power, increases blocking distortion, and doesn't make it through the output transformer, and your speaker cannot reproduce that stuff anyway. So now it is flat to right about an octave below your fundamental. So all your undertones, everything happens great, still has tons of lows. It just is optimized for guitar and sounds nicer. Now we have to remember, before you think, oh, this guy's arguing with Leo Fender. Leo Fender was not designing guitar amps. Leo Fender was designing amplifiers for anything that his company could sell you. And that would have included basses, electric violins, lap steels, pedal steels, Rhodes pianos, so he wanted these things to be very full frequency response, because he would have no problem with someone gigging with this 59 Vibrolux and a 59 Bassman. He would have no problem with someone plugging a Rhodes piano into this. I think those came a little bit later, but still, accordions, whatever, plug your vocals into it. This was an all-purpose amp from his perspective. Well, we're not playing P-bass through this. We're not playing the lowest octave of an electric piano through this. We're playing guitar. So it needs to be able to accommodate the low E, which in standard is about 81, 82 hertz, able to handle drop tunings, and really for high fidelity audio use, an octave below that. So that's what this does. It doesn't change the good parts of the amp's sound. In fact, it enhances them, because you don't have all the artifacts from this little circuit trying to keep up with all the massive frequencies. Now, I'm not saying that your guitar puts out 7 hertz. It does not by itself. But every time that the skin of your fingers brushes a guitar string, you are generating frequencies that we cannot hear. And this amp tries to reproduce them. They're not frequencies we want, but it robs the amp of power and causes problems with the cathodione phase inverter. So new cathode bypass caps here, some pretty little Vichets. Wherever possible, I retained the original resistors. Where I had to replace them, I used the proper ones for the period. These 2 Astrons are remaining in the amp. All the other Astrons were leaking, but these Astrons don't get high DC on them because this one blocks it. This one has been changed. The other 2 in the LFO are still fine, so they can stay in the amp. It's just a memento of what the amp used to be full of. So we've got 3 new 16 microfarad, 450 volt F&T filter caps, which is the proper value for this circuit. I would argue that that might even sound even better were this to be increased to a 30 or a 47, but we went with the 16s, which is the original. All new ground, had to remove all the solder from these eyelets, clean it all up, put it all back. There's the bias capacitor, another Vichet. You can see here, we've got a 3 watt, 470 ohm dropping resistor here, and then the half watt here. So this would have been a 1 watt carbon comp originally. Carbon comps are not fantastic in power supplies. These Vichets wire wounds are, actually it's a wire wound. These Vichet wire wounds are about perfect for that. Now for the bias circuit. It originally would have been using the selenium rectifier rather than this 1N4007 that we have now. These fail, and when they fail, they emit toxic gas. Selenium is not good for us. This might have been what was available in 1959. It is not a good part. It is not a safe part to have voltage on anymore. So it's been replaced by a 1N4007. This was left in the amp just to be pretty and say, hey, remember? But as far as the bias circuit goes, now we have adjustable bias. There's this resistor coming from the bias tap of the transformer going to the 1N4007, and then this trim pot, and then a limiting resistor going to ground. And this allows a wide variety of 6v6s to be used in this amp with modern wall voltages. Is it lovely? It's debatable. It sounds lovely, it's reliable, and it does not involve modding the chassis to drill for a full pot or anything. So I think it is a good suggestion. And for anyone wondering or thinking that this looks flimsy, this is the same pot, exactly the same pot used in many, many Marshall builds. And I have seen so many of them with wires extending the reach of these, and they work just fine. It's just not a lot of mass. It's well supported. These 2 legs are both soldered to this eyelet, and then this one is wrapped around this resistor, which is wrapped around it, and goes a very short distance to here. So it's actually very secure, and I'm using the HT wire just to kind of cushion it a little bit so that this is not going to have many vibrations. And those heater balance resistors are going to the same ground there rather than to chassis. You can see here, this old solder mark here, this is where one side of the heaters used to be just grounded to chassis. Not a good thing. I think the last thing to mention, though it's one of the first things I did, are these chassis grounds, which go from the chassis to the board. Those wires had been cut too short and were pulling out of all the eyelets. It's hard to show this with the light, sorry. I've got a new light coming today which will make all these problems go away. So it was pulling out of this eyelet. This one was pulling out of this eyelet, et cetera, et cetera. So I removed them. I cleaned up the chassis in that area. I put in new bus wire with very clean, shiny, pretty solder joints, which then go to the ground points on the board in a J-hook. So they are never going to come out of these eyelets. You can remove the solder and the ZAMP will still work with just enough excess that if you need to pull the board up, the wire will allow that, but not so much that you've got big loops of it everywhere. So those, they even look like they sound good, don't they? Doesn't that just look like it should sound awesome? Let's see if that holds up in reality.